Hey there. Tonight, we're not chasing kings through crumbling castles or following knights into foggy battles. We're slipping behind the silk curtains of a royal palace, into the mind of a woman with more power than anyone else, and far less patience. She didn't lead armies. She didn't ride into war. She ruled with ink, whispers, and the occasional sudden purge of her entire government. This is the story of Wu Zetian, China's only empress in her own name. A woman so brilliant, and so bored, she once fired every minister in the room just to see what would happen next. It's absurd. It's real. And it's the kind of history that makes you wonder how we're all still standing. So if this kind of sleepy chaos helps your mind wind down, feel free to like, subscribe, or just leave a little note in the comments. Where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? Sometimes, knowing you're not the only one awake makes all the difference. Now exhale. Let the noise fade. And follow me into candlelit courts, flying scrolls, and the strange, silent logic of absolute power. Close your eyes. And listen. The sky over imperial China was vast and pale, like parchment left too long in the sun, blank, impartial, and distant. It bore down on the people with the same quiet certainty as the social structure that ruled their lives. This was a land of poets and porcelain, of order etched in bone and philosophy chiseled into daily obedience. And from the moment you drew your first breath, your fate was already inked into a ledger by someone who would never know your name. At the summit of this vast social pyramid sat the emperor, the son of heaven. But do not be fooled by the poetry of the title. He was not a father to his people. He was a distant star in the bureaucratic cosmos, orbiting far above the toil and hunger of the common man. His divine right to rule, the mandate of heaven, was conditional, though few dared to say it aloud. So long as the rice grew, the rivers behaved, and the peasants kept their heads down, the mandate held. But one bad harvest, one rebellion, and heaven could change its mind. Dynasties fell not just from swords, but from silence and famine. Below the emperor stood the scholar officials, the spiritual aristocracy of ink and ideology. These were men forged by the furnace of the imperial exams, a brutal ordeal of memorization, literary perfection, and moral recitation. From childhood, they studied Confucian texts until their spines curled and their eyesight dimmed. They quoted the Analects in their sleep and corrected their parents' calligraphy before they could grow a beard. Success brought not only prestige but power, a place in the machinery of governance, complete with robes, respect, and the legal right to look down on everyone else. Then came the farmers, praised by philosophers yet punished by circumstance. Their backs bent like the crescent moons they worked beneath. They were the feeders of the empire, the supposed moral foundation of society. But in truth, they toiled in filth, prayed for weather they couldn't control, and delivered grain they could barely spare. Officials praised their virtue while increasing their taxes. And when locusts or floods came, it was the farmers who died quietly, without inscriptions or imperial concern. Below them were the artisans, weavers, potters, woodworkers, creators of the empire's beauty. Their skills were inherited, their craft a lifelong apprenticeship in patience. They carved dragons into jade, etched stories into bronze, and painted scenes onto silk that emperors draped across their palaces. Yet these creators of beauty were denied honor. Their work was admired, but they themselves remained invisible, trapped between usefulness and social invisibility. Then the merchants. Rich, shrewd, and thoroughly distrusted. To the Confucian mind, they were moral parasites, people who gained wealth not through toil, but through transaction. A scholar could quote philosophy about filial duty, a merchant could buy the scholar's house. But wealth did not wash away disdain. They lived lavishly in shadow, shunned by society yet essential to its survival. At the bottom, or perhaps beneath the bottom, were those whose lives didn't fit the hierarchy at all. Soldiers, butchers, actors, undertakers. Their professions were considered necessary evils, and their touch often seen as contaminating. Executioners were feared, never thanked. Actors could make a room weep, but were forbidden to marry outside their caste. A soldier might save the border, but he'd still be barred from the exam hall. And still lower, beneath the foundation stones, were the women. They did not climb the pyramid. They held it up. A woman in imperial China was not part of society, she was part of its scenery. From birth, she was trained not to speak too much, not to laugh too loud, not to think too differently. Her duty was obedience, first to her father, then her husband, and finally her sons. Her body belonged to others, as a vessel, a servant, a symbol of family honor. Girls were rarely educated. If they learned to read, it was for poetry about silence. If they dreamed, they kept those dreams folded tightly like the letters they could never send. The most lauded trait in a woman was stillness, in voice, in will, in life. She was a quiet contributor to everyone else's legacy but her own. And yet, in this pyramid of silk and stone, there was one universal truth: movement was nearly impossible. Social mobility wasn't a ladder, it was a rope ladder soaked in oil, hanging over a pit. If you were born to a farmer, you would die a farmer. If you were born a butcher, you might as well have been born invisible. If you were born a girl, society handed you a script and expected you to perform it without improvisation. There were exceptions, of course. A brilliant scholar might rise. A merchant's wealth might buy his grandson an education. A concubine might whisper her way into influence. But these were not pathways. They were accidents, curiosities, not norms. This was imperial China. Beautiful, brilliant, and utterly rigid. A world where order was everything, hierarchy sacred, and the only thing more feared than rebellion was change. To rise in imperial China, you didn't need a sword. You needed a brush, and the patience to wield it for decades. In theory, the imperial civil service exams were the great equalizer. It didn't matter if your father was a farmer or a merchant, a butcher or a beggar. What mattered was that you could quote Confucius backward in the rain while writing poetry that made grown men cry. The system promised meritocracy. In practice, it offered a life of ink-stained fingers, back pain, and the constant taste of failure. Boys began studying before their teeth came in. Tutors were hired if you could afford them. If not, your parents became your instructors, and every cracked bowl of rice came with a recitation of ancient texts. In small villages, students memorized moral lessons by lamplight, repeating the analects until their voices broke or their minds did. Parents whispered bedtime stories not of dragons or ghosts, but of sons who passed the exam and bought their mother's silk. The first hurdle was the local exam, enough to get you noticed by minor officials or qualify for a clerk's job. But the real prize was the Jinshi, the metropolitan exam held in the capital. Past that, and you didn't just enter government. You entered legend. Your name was carved into stone. You returned to your village like a demigod. People bowed. Neighbors wept. Enemies seethed. And your family? They ascended with you. Your father's debts vanished. Your mother's hands were no longer calloused from washing. Your brothers and cousins dined like nobles. One man's success could lift an entire bloodline. But few ever passed. Exams were held in special compounds, vast courtyards filled with thousands of narrow stalls, barely wider than a coffin. Each man was assigned a cubicle, a stone slab, 3 wooden boards, and a bucket for waste. There, for 3 days and nights, they wrote until their fingers bled or their minds frayed. Guards patrolled constantly to prevent cheating. Food was passed through small slots. Conversation was forbidden. Men went mad in those cells. Some died. Others faked madness to be carried out. They wrote essays, poems, policy proposals, all in flawless classical Chinese, a language as elegant as it was cruel to those who stumbled. They argued the finer points of morality, balance, filial piety, tax structure. A single wrong character could doom a candidate. A smudged brushstroke could erase a lifetime of effort. And when results came, they came on slips of paper nailed to public boards, read aloud by runners to waiting crowds. Some collapsed upon hearing their name. Others never heard it. These men walked home in silence, carrying their failure like a second skin. Some tried again. And again. And again. It was not uncommon for a man to take the exam a dozen times before passing. Or never. But those who did pass became part of the ruling class. They governed provinces, led military campaigns, interpreted law. Their word became policy. Their calligraphy adorned imperial edicts. And their descendants, once barefoot sons of peasants, became aristocracy in all but name. And yet, for all its beauty, the exam system was a machine with teeth. It devoured ambition and spat out broken men. A lifetime could be lost chasing one line of verse, one flawless essay. Families bankrupted themselves for a chance at status. Mothers wept at their sons' silence, their retreat into scrolls and ink. The Confucian ideal was noble, a society led by the wise and just. But ideals don't shelter you from the cold or feed you when the rice runs out. For most, the exam was not a path. It was a prison, one that smelled of ink and desperation. Still, the system endured, for over 1,000 years. Because for every 100,000 boys who failed, one rose. And in that rise, the myth was reborn, that knowledge could overcome birth, that a brush could change a life, and that in China, even a peasant's son could shape an empire. It was, of course, mostly a lie. But sometimes, just sometimes, lies build better dreams than truth ever could. They called him the Son of Heaven, but he rarely saw the sun. The Emperor of China lived behind screens, of silk, of jade, of protocol. His palace was not a home, but a labyrinth. Courtyards led to corridors, corridors to chambers, chambers to still more doors, each guarded by silence and ritual. He could summon armies with a word, yet required 3 layers of eunuchs to fetch his inkstone. He ruled a continent, but could not step outside unannounced. The throne was golden, yes. But it was also a cage. To speak to the emperor was to perform a dance choreographed by centuries of etiquette. One did not meet him. One was permitted to approach. You knelt, forehead to marble, never making eye contact, never daring to breathe too deeply. Your voice shook. Your bones ached. And if you said the wrong thing, or even the right thing in the wrong tone, your next audience might be with the executioner. He was, after all, not a man. He was a symbol. A celestial body in human form. The pivot of all existence. But behind the silk robes and embroidered dragons was still a living, aging, sometimes frightened soul. And the system that exalted him also isolated him. Each morning, the emperor was awakened by palace attendants who had been awake for hours. His breakfast was tasted for poison, his robes selected according to ritual. The number of steps he took, the direction he faced, the very moment he read petitions, all governed by calendars older than memory. He was watched, bowed to, obeyed. But he was rarely known. His only real companions were the eunuchs, castrated as boys, raised within the palace walls, and trained in the soft warfare of survival. They were servants, spies, and sometimes the emperor's only friends. Some were loyal. Many were not. But all of them understood the game. Proximity was power. And in a world where even the emperor's dreams might be transcribed and analyzed, the one who held the curtain controlled the stage. The court itself was a theater of masks. Ministers arrived each morning with scrolls tucked in their sleeves and fear in their hearts. They debated policy with voices flat and faces neutral. One wrong word could be read as treason. One missed bow could be interpreted as ambition. And yet the bureaucracy moved, slowly but relentlessly, like an enormous clock made of flesh and ink. The emperor's day was filled with ritual audiences, memorial readings, ceremonial sacrifices, calligraphy practice, and inspections of silk paintings he was obliged to admire. He met envoys from distant kingdoms, listened to omens interpreted by court astrologers, and nodded at verses written by trembling poets who hoped flattery could buy favor. His evenings, if lucky, ended in the company of concubines trained in art, music, and the skillful illusion of affection. But for all the bowing and incense, the emperor could never be certain of anything. His food might be poisoned. His heirs might plot. His generals might rebel. Even the heavens, which gave him legitimacy, could just as easily revoke it. A comet, an earthquake, a failed harvest, all were read as divine displeasure. And if enough people believed it, that displeasure could become revolution. So he consulted with oracles. He read ancient texts. He sent spies to spy on his own spies. And he waited, always waited, for signs. Was that cough the beginning of death? Was that official silence loyalty or contempt? Was heaven still watching, or had it already looked away? In his rare private hours, he sometimes painted. Or read poetry. Or simply walked in silence, flanked by guards who would never speak of what they saw. He might pause by a carp pond, watching the water ripple with no intention of ever stepping in. Because the truth, quietly shared among the few who understood such things, was this: the emperor was not powerful because he could act. He was powerful because he could prevent others from acting. That was the secret of the dragon throne. It did not move swiftly. It endured. And somewhere, beneath layers of silk and formality, beneath the weight of a nation and 1,000 watching eyes, sat a man, one who had once been a boy, told he was divine, and who had spent his life trying to live up to a myth no human could hold forever. If a man's fate in imperial China was carved in stone, a woman's was written on water, beautiful, fleeting, and quickly erased. She was born with quiet celebration, if any at all. While red threads were tied to her wrists to ward off wandering spirits, the true danger wasn't from the unseen, it was the seen. A daughter meant a future expense. A daughter meant no continuation of the family name. A daughter, in the strict mathematics of survival, was a gamble. Some fathers drank in silence. Some mothers simply sighed and wrapped the newborn tighter, as if warmth might compensate for disappointment. Her training began early. She was not taught to reach, only to receive. She learned to bow before she could walk, to smile before she could think, and to suppress her voice before it could fully form. She watched her mother cook without eating, stitch without rest, speak without defiance. She memorized movements, silences, glances. She learned that virtue was obedience, that beauty was stillness, and that strength was endurance wrapped in silk. In wealthier households, girls were instructed in poetry, calligraphy, and music, but always through a lens of utility. A graceful song could please a husband. A well-written poem could elevate family honor. But intellect, if it sparkled too brightly, was polished down. A clever girl might embarrass a matchmaker. A witty wife might threaten a husband. So cleverness was repackaged as modesty, and wit as demure quiet. Marriage was her destiny, and she knew it before she bled. It came wrapped in red silk, smoke, and negotiation. Matchmakers with scrolls and ledgers compared birth times, bloodlines, dowries. Love was never a factor. It was a myth from shadow plays, not from real life. A good match meant survival. A great match meant status. Her opinion was irrelevant. On her wedding day, she became a procession, not a person. Carried in a palanquin draped in crimson, she was not allowed to touch the earth, not because she was honored, but because she was transitioning ownership. From father to husband. From childhood to servitude. From one silence to another. The music was loud. The firecrackers deafening. But inside her veil, it was quiet. Often, there were tears, not of joy, but of mourning for a life already slipping away. In her new household, she knelt before ancestors she had never known, poured tea for in-laws who would become masters, and entered a world of layered obedience. Her primary duty, to produce sons. Daughters were a disappointment. Childlessness was shame. And if the womb remained still for too long, her husband's family might whisper of concubines, or worse, of return. If her husband was kind, she might find pockets of peace. If he was indifferent, she might find ways to make herself useful. If he was cruel, she had few places to turn. The law protected her only in theory. In practice, the household governed itself. Her mother-in-law could beat her. Her husband could starve her. And her pain would vanish behind closed doors. But even in this narrow life, women found ways to breathe. They sang lullabies older than memory, planted herbs with knowledge passed in whispers, and stitched poetry into their sleeves. They made dumplings for festivals, traced prayers into incense smoke, and found brief moments of self in the courtyard sun. They told stories to their daughters, not of escape, but of endurance. Some became midwives, protectors of life and death, feared and needed. Others joined Buddhist convents, where silence meant sanctuary, not servitude. And some, a rare few, pushed through history's silence to leave names: Empress Wu, who ruled with iron will; Li Qingzhao, who wrote poems like falling leaves; Lin Xinjiang, who led armies with dagger in hand. These women were exceptions. But their echoes proved that within every girl born in a red-threaded cradle was the potential to shape kingdoms. Still, most women remained unnamed. They washed robes, not scrolls. Their words faded after they were spoken. Their handwriting lived only in recipes and letters never saved. They died quietly, often early, remembered briefly, if at all. Yet, they were the invisible scaffolding of empire. The Confucian texts mentioned women only in passing, mostly as objects of instruction. But beneath every temple stood mothers who taught prayers. Behind every successful son stood a mother who sacrificed food, rest, and voice. Even the emperor, cloaked in celestial titles, once lay in a woman's arms, small, crying, fragile. Imperial China did not grant its daughters thrones. But every throne stood atop the labor of women. Silent, steady, strong. And if you listen closely, behind every parchment of law and ledger of conquest, you'll find a lullaby, soft, defiant, and unbroken. To understand the empire, follow its roads, not to the palaces, but to the markets. Imperial China did not hum with war drums alone. Its heartbeat pulsed in the footsteps of merchants, the rhythm of wooden wheels over dust, the creak of salt barges, and the flutter of silk sleeves in open stalls. The emperor might rule from behind lacquered doors, but it was commerce, the quiet dance of coin and craft, that held the vast nation together. Silk was its crown jewel. Soft as breath, stronger than steel, and shimmering like starlight, it moved across mountains and deserts, linking China to lands so distant they became myth. Roman senators wore it with guilt and greed. Persian traders paid for it in glass, spices, and secrets. And at the heart of it all was a worm, the silkworm, chewing mulberry leaves in silence, spinning thread finer than hair. Sericulture was a guarded ritual. Imperial edicts once made it treason to reveal how silk was made. Peasant families passed down the craft like prayer. Women tended the worms. Men unwound the cocoons. And middlemen, sly, silver-tongued, turned bundles into fortunes. Caravans set out with rolls of cloth and returned months later with jade, horses, or foreign curiosities, coral, ivory, indigo-stained maps. But silk was not alone. Salt, white as bone and nearly as valuable, built bureaucracies. It preserved food, taxed villages, and funded dynasties. The government often claimed monopoly over its production, erecting entire departments to manage its flow. Salt inspectors became powerful, and feared. Corruption spread wherever salt touched hands. In dry regions, peasants boiled brine under iron pots, smoke stinging their eyes. In coastal cities, seawater was evaporated in neat rows of sunlit beds, leaving behind crystals like ghost snow. Salt was survival. Without it, bodies failed. Armies starved. Civilizations crumbled. Tea, too, bloomed into necessity. What began as a bitter medicinal brew became a national obsession. Monks sipped it in silence. Scholars praised it in verse. Laborers slurped it from chipped bowls. Traders carried bricks of it, compressed, stamped, and stacked like currency. Entire caravans crossed into Tibet and beyond, laden with tea and guarded as if they carried treasure. Because they did. And then there were the markets. Every city, no matter how small, had its beating heart in the bazaar. Morning mist gave way to the clang of copper pans, the cries of hawkers, the aroma of ginger, garlic, and steam. Butchers sharpened cleavers. Potters arranged their wares in pyramids of clay. Children darted between stalls. Elders haggled with ruthless grace. Paper charms hung beside dried fish. Lanterns flickered near medicine stalls. A storyteller, perched on a barrel, spun tales of ghost brides and monkey kings. Beside him, a thief disappeared into the crowd, fingers quick as breath. These places were messy, loud, and human. And in their messiness lived the truth of the empire, not in scrolls or proclamations, but in exchange. Ideas passed with goods. A foreign coin might carry a rumor. A bundle of herbs might mask a sedition letter. A box of porcelain might contain a spy's payment. Every cart was a question. Every pouch, a secret. The imperial government watched with sharp eyes. Officials kept ledgers. Licenses. Taxes. Informants. But for every rule, there was a workaround. Smugglers used river mist. Bribes changed hands under lanternlight. Some merchants became richer than governors. Some governors became merchants in secret. And some disappeared. Because while the Silk Road was lined with wealth, it was also paved with danger. Bandits preyed on the lonely stretches. Storms swallowed caravans whole. Illness crept through border towns. And trust, once broken, rarely healed. Still, they walked. From village to village, from oasis to mountain pass, from harbor to high plain, they walked. Bearing silk, salt, tea, and the quiet conviction that movement, not power, was what truly shaped a civilization. For in the end, every dynasty depended on more than armies or emperors. It depended on men who stitched borders with footsteps. On women who boiled salt and raised silkworms. On traders who bartered dreams across distances too vast for maps. Empires speak in edicts. But it is the whisper of trade, constant, patient, and unyielding, that holds them together. In a land as vast as an empire, where mountains cut across provinces like old scars and rivers wound through 100 dialects, there had to be something stronger than force to hold it all together. And so, China built an empire not just on swords, but on ink. It was a simple promise with impossible weight: any man, no matter how poor, could rise to greatness, if he could pass the exam. The imperial civil service examination, known as the Keiju, was more than a test. It was the beating heart of bureaucracy, the gate to power, and the dream of every scholar's family. It promised fairness. It promised order. And for centuries, it was the narrowest bridge from a straw-roofed village to a marble-floored ministry. From the age of 4 or 5, boys were taught to memorize, not understand, just memorize. First came the 3-character classic, then Confucius, Mencius, the 5 classics, the 4 books. They recited while walking, while eating, while half asleep. A child's voice repeating ancient wisdom became the lullaby of a scholar's home. By adolescence, the brightest among them could quote entire texts, not just the words, but the punctuation, the meaning behind the pause. They learned to write essays in rigid 8-part form, to weave poetry with strict meter and rhyme, to draw parallels between dynastic virtue and the correct arrangement of rice bowls at a family altar. For many, this was their only hope. A farmer's son who passed the exams could bring honor to 10 generations. He could earn the silk robes of a scholar official, wield the brush instead of the plow. No dowry could compete with such prestige. Matchmakers flocked to a newly minted jointure, the highest degree. Mothers wept. Fathers bowed before their sons. But to get there, a candidate had to survive not just study, but solitude. The provincial exam halls were cities of suffering. Thousands of candidates arrived with bundles of bedding, food, ink, brushes, and hope. Each was assigned a tiny cell, stone, dark, no wider than a coffin. For 3 days and 2 nights, they sat cross-legged, writing by candlelight, their backs pressed to damp walls, their futures bleeding onto paper. Some brought their own coffins, knowing they might die of exhaustion, hunger, or heartbreak. Guards patrolled for cheating. Food was rationed. Silence was absolute. No sounds but scratching ink and the flutter of exam papers. It was not merely a test of intellect. It was a test of will. Most failed. Failure meant shame, not just personal, but communal. Neighbors whispered. Families sighed. A son who failed at 30 might still be studying at 50. Some never stopped. Their fingers bent with age, their hair grayed above textbooks worn thin. They were called Keiju widowers, married only to the exam. Yet the dream endured. Because those who passed rose like smoke. They were summoned to court, dressed in embroidered robes, and assigned posts in distant provinces. They judged lawsuits, collected taxes, wrote reports for the emperor himself. They became the state, one brushstroke at a time. But merit was never pure. Wealth bought better tutors. Connections greased bureaucratic wheels. Some families groomed sons for decades. Others bought degrees outright when corruption bloomed like mold in the margins. The system promised fairness, but fairness, like ink, could be watered down. Still, for all its flaws, the Keiju endured because it gave the illusion of control in a chaotic world. In a land ruled by dynasties and storms, where emperors rose and fell like seasons, the exam remained, solid, unchanging, merciless. And even those who failed did not forget. They became teachers, scribes, ghostwriters, or bitter poets. Their essays, rejected by the state, found second life in village schools and family altars. Knowledge, even wasted, was never worthless. By the time the Keiju was finally abolished in the early 20th century, it had shaped over 1,000 years of government, and countless lives. It was a ladder made of paper, ink, and pain. And for some, it was the only way to climb out of the dust. The Emperor of China was called the Son of Heaven, his will divine, his power absolute. But within the red walls of the Forbidden City, where the world believed he ruled alone, another force moved in shadows. They wore no crowns. Their names rarely survived. They bore the emperor's secrets, guarded his silence, and sometimes pulled strings with fingers that no longer shook from fear, because they had long since forgotten what fear was. They were the eunuchs. To the outer world, a eunuch was a man unmade, castrated before puberty, denied both legacy and lineage. Some were orphans. Others were sold by starving families. A few volunteered, desperate for a chance to escape hunger, war, or obscurity. The procedure was brutal. Infection was common. Many bled to death. Those who survived passed into the inner world, a realm where the emperor's voice echoed loudest, and the laws of man blurred into ritual. Within the palace, the eunuchs were everywhere and nowhere. They lit the incense. They polished the jade. They delivered scrolls, tended lamps, prepared robes, carried commands. They watched the emperor sleep. They measured his meals. They walked silently behind veils and silk screens, absorbing everything and speaking nothing. In theory, they held no power. In practice, they often held the most. Because the emperor, cloistered since childhood, trusted few. His officials came and went. His generals fought and fell. His wives maneuvered in whispers. But the eunuchs, they stayed. They grew with him, served him, knew him. They were servants, yes. But also confessors. Gatekeepers. Sometimes even puppeteers. Some were loyal to the bone. They protected their master like a god. They shielded him from poison, from betrayal, from despair. They reminded him to eat, to rest, to breathe. They learned which concubines schemed, which ministers lied. They passed messages no courier dared carry. And they did so without ambition, or so it seemed. But power, once tasted, does not remain silent. Some eunuchs amassed fortunes. Some ruled from behind curtains, forging imperial seals and altering edicts. Some framed ministers. Some exiled queens. Some whispered a name to the emperor, and that name vanished from history. There were eunuchs who built armies, commissioned temples, and turned entire courts into theaters of manipulation. And there were those who fell. Because the tide turned quickly in court. A eunuch who rose too high became a threat. Accusations followed. Trials staged. Torture extracted confessions. Executions restored balance, if only for a moment. But the system endured. Because no one else could enter the sacred spaces. Ministers were barred. Soldiers too crude. Wives too partial. Only the eunuchs, stripped of family ties, were trusted to move freely. And in their freedom, they found leverage. The people feared them. In popular tales, eunuchs were villains, twisted, scheming, cruel. They were blamed for everything: droughts, taxes, imperial foolishness. Their portraits in opera were hunched, shrill, venomous. Yet behind the stage makeup was a deeper truth: these were men who had been broken to serve an unbreakable machine. They had no children to bury them. No wives to mourn them. Their names were inked in palace rosters, erased by the next regime. Their graves, when granted, were modest. Their wealth, when seized, was paraded as proof of corruption, even when it was survival. But not all eunuchs sought power. Some simply endured. They lit lanterns for decades, learned poetry by heart, and wept when emperors died. Some wrote memoirs, fragile, trembling scripts that survived only in corners of old libraries. In them, we see the loneliness, the longing, the strange pride in serving history, even if it never remembered their faces. They were not emperors. But sometimes, when the moon rose over the palace roof and the son of heaven dreamed restlessly on his dragon-embroidered pillow, it was a eunuch who stood beside him, steady, silent, loyal beyond comprehension. And in that moment, for all the world's cruelty, they were not forgotten. They were indispensable. At the heart of Beijing lies a palace that doesn't breathe, it waits. The Forbidden City. Nearly 1,000 buildings. Over 9,000 rooms. More than 500 years of whispered commands and unspoken sorrow. From above, it looks orderly, a golden rectangle hemmed in by high crimson walls. But inside, it is a world unto itself, built not just with wood and stone, but with fear, control, and ritual. It is where emperors were crowned, where empresses wept behind silk curtains, and where footsteps echoed louder than voices. Few ever entered. Fewer still understood it. They called it forbidden for a reason. To the outside world, it was a symbol of divine rule, the cosmic center where heaven touched earth. Everything was arranged with celestial precision. The layout followed the principles of yin and yang, the 5 elements, the 4 cardinal directions. Each corridor pointed to harmony. Each threshold guarded fate. Even the number of statues on the eaves, always odd, was chosen with intention. But behind the balance was control. At dawn, the palace stirred in silence. Courtiers bowed 3 times before they dared speak. Eunuchs moved like shadows, tending incense, adjusting robes, unrolling scrolls on polished lacquered tables. The emperor emerged not as a man, but a performance, adorned in dragon robes, encircled by silence. He walked alone, and yet never unwatched. Walls did not echo in the Forbidden City. They absorbed. Secrets sank into its bricks like rain into soil. A word spoken too loudly could cost a life. A glance held too long could shift an entire dynasty. Children of the imperial blood played in courtyards surrounded by guards. Their games rehearsed obedience. Their laughter, soft and rehearsed. The emperor's sons rarely saw the world beyond the vermilion gates. Their first steps were measured. Their first words judged. Even in infancy, they were being prepared, or discarded. Concubines lived in beautiful cages. They were chosen as teenagers, sometimes younger, selected for beauty, grace, ancestry. Some never saw the emperor. Others bore him sons, only to lose them in political storms they barely understood. They competed not with each other, but with silence, isolation, and the will of unseen forces. A single misplaced ornament, a single whisper to the wrong maid, and a woman might vanish from the records, erased like a smudge from a scroll. The Forbidden City was a place of appearances. Even the gardens obeyed design. Every pebble, every pond, every gnarled pine was chosen, placed, and maintained. Nature was not allowed to be wild. It had to be imperial. And yet, cracks formed. Sometimes, in the hush of twilight, a poet-emperor would slip away to scribble a verse about the moonlight on roof tiles. A bored prince might learn to carve jade in secret. A maid might teach a princess to hum folk songs from the provinces. Life seeped in, not loudly, but inevitably. There were moments of joy, too. Weddings lit up the courtyards with red lanterns and peals of bells. Snow fell like feathers across the yellow roofs. Crane-shaped incense holders puffed fragrant smoke into corridors of gold and red. In spring, the cherry blossoms bloomed. For a few days, even sorrow looked beautiful. But peace was always temporary. Power in the Forbidden City shifted like sand under silk. Ministers schemed in calligraphy. Empresses clashed behind embroidery hoops. Servants vanished for knowing too much, or too little, or simply being in the wrong hallway at the wrong hour. And in the center of it all sat the emperor, isolated, worshipped, and often unbearably alone. He could command armies with a brushstroke. But he could not trust his food without a taster. He could issue edicts to change the fate of a province. But he could not walk the street outside his gates. He was the dragon, caged in jade. When a new dynasty rose, the Forbidden City changed banners, names, customs, but not its soul. Ming became Qing. Han robes gave way to Manchu court dress. The thrones were recarved. The rituals rewritten. But the quiet terror remained. So did the weight of centuries. And when the empire finally fell, the gates did not burst open with joy. They creaked. And the silence, older than memory, finally exhaled. She was 5 when it began. The morning was quiet, the air tinged with incense. Her mother said nothing, only stroked her hair and whispered that today she would begin to become beautiful. The girl didn't understand, beauty didn't hurt. Or so she thought. Then came the basin of hot water, the cloths, the herbal paste. Her grandmother knelt beside her, ancient hands steady, as her mother took her feet and began to bend. It started with the toes. Each one curled under unnaturally, pressed toward the sole until the bones strained. The arch was broken next, deliberately, with pressure, until the foot folded like a crescent moon. The girl screamed once. After that, she bit her sleeve. Cloth strips wrapped tight, tighter still, pulled with the precision of generations. The pain pulsed up her legs, into her back, into her chest. She felt like she couldn't breathe. But outside, the neighbors heard nothing. Only another girl becoming eligible. This was foot binding, lotus feet, they called it. A tradition that spanned dynasties. A ritual of status, suffering, and control. Small feet meant beauty. Beauty meant marriage. Marriage meant survival. The ideal length was 3 inches, no longer than a thumb. Feet that small could not walk far, nor fast. But they looked delicate in embroidered slippers, peeking beneath silk hems like whispers of wealth. A man might never see his bride's face before marriage, but he would hear of her feet. She walks like a willow in the wind, they'd say, a compliment born of pain. It began with the upper class. Elite families wanted daughters who could marry into power. Mothers bound their daughters' feet not out of cruelty, but love, brutal, practical love. A girl with unbound feet might never find a husband. Worse, she might bring shame. Over time, it trickled down. Merchants. Farmers. Even peasants tried to imitate the elite. The poorer the family, the rougher the binding. Without soft cloth or skilled hands, infection set in quickly. Toes blackened, then fell off. Some girls lost both feet before 10. some learned to walk again. Others never did. But they still married. Because the value was in the suffering. A bound foot was proof of obedience, endurance, sacrifice. It showed that a girl could withstand hardship, remain still, remain loyal. In a culture that prized harmony and hierarchy, foot-binding became the perfect metaphor, beautiful on the outside, broken within. Girls learned to hide the pain, to shuffle gracefully, to embroider their own slippers, bright as phoenixes, proud as paper flags. Mothers instructed them how to soak their feet, how to rewrap the bindings each night, how to smile when walking felt like knives. Some resisted. There are stories, rarely told, of girls who fled, who tore off the cloth, who refused to bind. But they were rare, and often punished. In a world where so much was already decided, birth, class, duty, resisting foot-binding was more than rebellion. It was social death. Yet change came, slowly. In the late 19th century, foreign missionaries began to denounce the practice. Reformers within China followed. Mothers hesitated. Schools began to accept girls with natural feet. By the early 20th century, government bans were issued. Binding became shameful, the symbol of a backward past. But unbinding was harder than it seemed. Decades of shaping could not be undone in days. Some women kept binding in secret. Others unwrapped their feet for the first time in years and wept, not from pain, but from the strange weight of freedom. Today, few pairs of lotus shoes remain. They sit in museums, fragile and bright, like relics of a vanished world. Most visitors stare in disbelief. Why would they do this, they ask. But the truth is not in the shoes. It's in the silence between mother and daughter. In the hands that wrapped the cloth. In the lives shaped by a beauty that demanded pain. And in the quiet footsteps of a woman who learned to walk not for herself, but for what the world expected her to be. In a quiet village nestled between mountains and memory, a family lit incense at midnight. Not for the living, but for a son already buried. He had died young, before marriage, before children, before honor could be fulfilled. His bones rested beneath a carved stone tablet, but his spirit, they said, could not rest. His room was still swept. His shoes still kept under the bed. And now, the matchmaker had come with a proposal. Not for a living bride, but for a ghost. This was a Ming-hun, a ghost marriage. A union not of two hearts, but of two souls denied closure. In imperial China, where family lines mattered more than breath, to die unmarried was a kind of curse. An unmarried ghost wandered. It grew restless. It might bring misfortune, sickness, withered crops, broken heirlooms. Even among the educated, such beliefs endured. After all, peace was fragile, and the dead had long memories. The bride had also died young. Perhaps in illness. Perhaps by accident. Perhaps by grief. Her family, too, feared her spirit wandered alone. In life, the two had never met. But in death, their destinies aligned. So the matchmaker negotiated. Dowries were exchanged. Paper offerings prepared, miniature homes, horses, gold ingots, all folded from bamboo-thin paper and destined for fire. A small ceremony was held, often in secret. sometimes only a meal was shared. Sometimes a full wedding was staged, complete with a red veil, ancestral altars, and symbolic bedding. If the groom had already been buried, a wooden effigy of the bride might be placed beside him in the grave. Sometimes the bride's bones were unearthed and reburied with her new husband, binding them in the earth, as they never had been in life. And the families? They grieved. But they also exhaled. Because the ghost was no longer alone. This practice, strange to modern eyes, was rooted not in horror, but duty. In Confucian thought, the ancestral line must continue. Even in death, the dead needed family. Sons needed wives. Wives needed homes. To leave a spirit unwed was to leave it dishonored, vulnerable, detached from the chain of ancestors stretching back millennia. There were darker tales, too. Of the poor selling their daughters' remains to wealthier families desperate for a ghost bride. Of unscrupulous brokers stealing bones from graves to satisfy demand. Of women murdered so their corpses could complete a marriage pact. In remote provinces, such stories passed from village to village, half warning, half rumor. But not all were tragic. There were stories of peace. Of homes that grew calmer after a ghost marriage. Of a family that stopped hearing footsteps at night. Of dreams where the dead no longer wept. Of shrines that finally felt warm again. In time, as laws changed and modernity swept through China, the practice faded. And yet, not entirely. Even into the 20th and 21st centuries, occasional stories surfaced, of villages where fire still burned paper brides at dusk, where a lonely grave was opened, and two names were added to a single headstone. Because in China's vast landscape of belief, love and duty don't always end with death. Sometimes, they begin there. History remembers emperors by their conquests. But sometimes, it is the one behind the screen, quiet, calculating, adorned in silk and steel, who truly holds the empire. Her name was Cixi. But in the Forbidden City, few dared say it aloud. She entered the court as a low-ranking concubine of the Xianfeng emperor, one among many. She bore him a son. And with that, she gained a foothold in the palace, a sliver of power in a place where women were seen but rarely heard. When the emperor died young, the court expected his child, still a toddler, to serve as a silent figurehead under the guidance of regents. But Cixi had no intention of fading into the background. She allied with another imperial consort, Empress, and together they staged a coup, bloodless, precise, and devastating. The regents were arrested. Cixi emerged not as a widow, but as a force. She ruled behind a yellow silk curtain, where male ministers bowed and addressed the empty throne while she listened, veiled, alert, never absent. For nearly 50 years, she would rule China from the shadows. Officially, she was the Empress Dowager, mother of the emperor, guardian of the realm. But in truth, she was the pulse of the Qing court. Through coups, uprisings, wars, and foreign invasions, Cixi orchestrated the empire's survival, and sometimes, its stagnation. To some, she was a reformer. She abolished foot-binding in court. She promoted railways, telegraphs, and naval modernization. She opened China's doors, cautiously, to Western ideas, even as she kept foreign diplomats at arm's length. She funded schools for girls. She patronized the arts, rebuilt the summer palace, and introduced electricity to the Forbidden City. To others, she was a tyrant. She embezzled funds from the navy to build her own pleasure gardens. She suppressed rebellions with merciless efficiency. She imprisoned or poisoned those who challenged her, including reform-minded officials and even her own nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, whom she placed under house arrest after a failed modernization push. Like the palace she ruled, she was full of contradictions. She read poetry by candlelight and signed execution orders at dawn. She painted delicate flowers while plotting the exile of rivals. She drank jasmine tea while empires collapsed around her. And yet, she endured. At a time when the Qing dynasty trembled under the weight of foreign powers, Britain, France, Russia, Japan, she held the thread of sovereignty in hands dismissed as too soft, too feminine, too incapable. But Cixi was not soft. She was carved from the same jade as her throne, cool, polished, and unyielding. When the Boxer Rebellion erupted in 1899, an anti-foreign, anti-Christian uprising, Cixi first hesitated, then embraced it, declaring war on foreign powers in a last, desperate gamble. The result was catastrophic. Beijing was occupied, the Forbidden City humiliated, the dynasty weakened further. Still, she returned. She negotiated. She rebuilt. And when she died in 1908, just one day after the mysterious death of the Guangxu Emperor, she left behind a fractured empire, but also a legacy unmatched by any woman in Chinese imperial history. She never wore the dragon robe. But she controlled the dragon's breath. And in the long halls of the Forbidden City, where shadows still cling to lacquered doors and whispers hide behind carved screens, her presence lingers, not as an empress, not even as a mother, but as a woman who dared to rule when the world said she could only wait. In a quiet courtyard, far from the noise of war or palace intrigue, a boy dipped his brush into ink. The paper in front of him trembled, not from wind, but from the weight of generations. He was 9 years old. And already, his future balanced on the strength of his calligraphy. This was not a childhood of games or laughter. It was one of characters and scrolls, of Confucian classics recited before dawn and rewritten long after dusk. The boy's father had failed the exams 3 times. His grandfather had passed on the second try. Now it was his turn, to chase the title that could lift an entire family into honor. This was the imperial examination system. Keiju, they called it. The exam that chose not warriors, not merchants, but scholars to run the empire. It was a test of memory, logic, poetry, and obedience, an intellectual labyrinth designed not merely to identify intelligence, but to shape loyalty. At its peak, tens of thousands of candidates would compete each year. Only a few hundred would pass. The odds were not kind. The exam halls were notorious. Small stone cubicles, barely large enough to lie down in, lined row after row under an open sky. Each candidate brought his food, his bedding, his chamber pot, and remained there for days, isolated, observed, and consumed by ink. Cheating was punished harshly. Whispered verses could mean exile. A hidden crib sheet, a lifetime ban. Some swallowed notes before inspection. Some tattooed answers on their skin. Others memorized entire texts, knowing that forgetting even a single character might mean failure. And yet they came. From mountain villages. From riverside towns. From dusty border provinces. Sons of farmers and blacksmiths, monks and merchants. Because to pass the exams was to escape obscurity. It was to become a jinsher, a presented scholar. With that title came robes of honor, an audience with the emperor, and a path into the civil service. A scholar did not need wealth. He needed discipline, silence, and patience. The questions were arcane. Explain the meaning of righteousness in Book V of the Analects. Compose a poem on the moon's reflection in a spring river. Describe the proper behavior of a magistrate during a famine. Every answer was written by hand, judged not only for content, but for grace. A sloppy stroke could erase a lifetime of study. Families gambled everything. They sold land for tutors. They married late, or not at all. The family honor rested on one boy's brush. And if he passed? Firecrackers rang through the streets. Red banners were hung. Strangers bowed. The scholar's name was carved into stone, into memory. But most failed. Some tried again and again, into their 40s, 50s, older. Their hair grayed. Their eyesight dimmed. Their hands trembled. But still, they studied. Because failure was not just personal, it was ancestral. A man who died without passing the exams was said to have lived in vain. And yet, there was dignity in the attempt. The scholar was a symbol of virtue. He was poor, but wise. Humble, but elevated. In villages where soldiers were feared and merchants envied, the scholar was respected. He could write poems for weddings, letters for the illiterate, memorials for the dead. And if he passed? He became part of the machinery of empire, appointed to provinces, assigned to courts, charged with collecting taxes, settling disputes, upholding law. The state did not run on swords. It ran on ink. For over 1,000 years, this system shaped China. It created a bureaucracy unmatched in history. It united a vast, diverse empire under a single philosophical ideal, Confucianism. It gave power to the studious. It replaced nobility of blood with nobility of mind. But it also demanded conformity. Innovation was discouraged. Original thought, suspect. The system rewarded those who repeated, not those who questioned. And in time, this rigidity became a burden. By the late 19th century, the world had changed. Steamships arrived. Cannons roared. Foreign powers carved spheres of influence. And still, scholars debated the meaning of ancient texts. Reformers cried for change. The exams were suspended. Then abolished. But their legacy endures. In libraries filled with brush-written scrolls. In carved stones bearing the names of forgotten boys who once dreamed of changing the world with ink. In the quiet rooms where students still study late into the night, chasing a future shaped not by blood, but by knowledge. And in every calligraphed stroke that still bends, graceful, deliberate, eternal. He walked without echo. Not because he was stealthy, but because the forbidden city had long since swallowed the sound of his steps. He was a eunuch, a servant of the palace, a man unmade to serve more perfectly. In his long robes, with shaven head and lowered eyes, he passed through silk-draped corridors carrying secrets no one dared speak aloud. His voice, soft and clear, held no tremble. His manner was precise, without question. His loyalty had been paid in flesh, years ago, in an outbuilding behind a temple. He had knelt, bleeding, while an old man with shaking hands performed the ritual. There were no prayers. Only gauze and waiting. If he lived, he might enter the palace. If not, his body would be burned, forgotten, unnamed. He had survived. Thousands like him had not. Eunuchs had served China's courts for centuries, gatekeepers, messengers, stewards of treasure, guardians of the inner palace. They were men stripped of lineage, desire, and legacy. In exchange, they were allowed proximity to power. No sons. No daughters. No tombs with descendants to tend their names. But they could whisper in an emperor's ear. They could carry imperial edicts across the kingdom. They could shape dynasties. Their roles began small, sweeping, serving tea, standing beside braziers with warm cloaks for nobles. But the clever ones rose. They learned to read court documents upside down. They listened more than they spoke. They carried gossip from one chamber to another, always slightly altered, always useful. They became indispensable to those who ruled but never wanted to touch the machinery of ruling. And some became dangerous. During the Ming dynasty, the eunuch Wei Zhongxian wielded more power than most ministers. He decided appointments. He oversaw the secret police. He built temples in his own name. Officials who opposed him vanished. Those who praised him rose like lanterns. Others followed, some cruel, some merely cunning. They filled the gaps left by weak emperors and fearful ministers. In a palace where the emperor might be a boy, or ill, or uninterested, the eunuch became the true pivot of the realm. But for all their influence, they remained outsiders. They were mocked by scholars, feared by generals, pitied by priests. Their power was personal, not institutional. They could be executed on a whim, stripped of title, exiled in disgrace. No matter how high they climbed, they never escaped the shadow of their loss. And yet, there was grace. Some eunuchs lived quiet lives. They managed libraries, tended gardens, cared for concubines like uncles, not predators. They formed bonds with imperial children, offering kindness in a world where affection was rare. They built their own halls within the palace, modest, but clean. They created their own rituals. Some adopted boys from the countryside, not as heirs, but as apprentices. They wrote poetry. They wept in private. They prayed. In death, they often requested simple graves. No fanfare. Just a name and a line of verse, if they were lucky. When the Qing dynasty fell, the palace emptied slowly. Some eunuchs stayed behind, tending the halls even as the imperial family was sent away. Others wandered into the city, unsure of who they were without the court. They had no homes to return to. Their sacrifice had always been one way. Today, their stories are half-remembered, often reduced to caricature, to whispers of treachery or foolishness. But the truth is quieter, deeper. They were men who gave everything to belong, and in return, belonged nowhere. Yet for centuries, they kept the heart of an empire beating, not with swords, but with silence. It ended not with a roar, but with a letter. A boy of 6 sat beneath the golden beams of the forbidden city, clutching a document he could not read. Around him, ministers wept. Eunuchs bowed so low their foreheads touched the cold stone. Outside the vermilion gates, revolutionaries waited, not with fire and steel, but with papers and protocol. This was 1912. And the boy was Emperor Puyi, the last son of heaven. He had ruled nothing. He had signed nothing. He had played in courtyards his ancestors had died defending. He was called the Xiantong Emperor, but no edict he issued carried true weight. The world had already moved on. Railways cut through ancient landscapes. Telegraph wires hummed over silent temples. The dynasty that once sent envoys to the corners of the earth now couldn't hold its own capital. China had fractured. For centuries, the Qing had ruled, a Manchu dynasty holding a Han majority under strict codes and Confucian ideals. But corruption festered. Famines went unanswered. Foreign powers carved ports and privileges from China's flesh like butchers' knives. Britain brought opium. France brought priests. Japan brought war. And the people brought change. Reformers spoke of republics. Students translated French revolutionaries and German philosophers. Warlords raised private armies. Peasants, once silent, began to murmur. Then protest. Then march. In 1908, the Empress Dowager Cixi died, the iron matriarch who had ruled from behind silk curtains. In her absence, the court lost direction. A few years later, a bomb exploded in Wuchang. Soldiers mutinied. Provinces declared independence. And in that quiet chaos, the empire collapsed. The abdication of Puyi was symbolic, a gentle sunset after a day already lost. He remained in the Forbidden City for a time, treated as a guest in his own palace. He fed the fish. He studied English. He listened to gramophones, unaware the world outside was breaking and reforming by the hour. But even that silence would not last. In 1924, a warlord evicted him. He wandered, lived in exile, and eventually, tragically, was installed by the Japanese as a puppet emperor in Manchukuo. There, he wore robes of power but signed orders written by others. When World War II ended, he was captured by the Soviets, then returned to a new China, a China without emperors. For years, he lived as a gardener. He trimmed hedges for a government that had once called him a tyrant. He queued for rice like everyone else. He learned humility in a nation that had buried its gods. And perhaps, that was the truest end of the empire. Not in fire. Not in battle. But in quiet surrender. A child emperor turned old man, sweeping leaves, watched by strangers who barely remembered the dynasty he once embodied. The Forbidden City became a museum. Tourists walked its corridors, where eunuchs once whispered and concubines once wept. Dust settled where dragons once watched. Portraits faded. Thrones remained empty. But the silence held memory. Of scribes and scholars. Of rebels and rulers. Of silk robes, bent backs, broken feet, calloused hands. Of a nation so vast, so ancient, it could contain contradictions as easily as clay holds water. Imperial China did not vanish. It changed. It melted into the marrow of modern China, into its languages, its customs, its architecture, its ghosts. And even now, When someone recites a Tang poem or sweeps a grave or serves tea with both hands, something of the empire lingers. Not in emperors, but in echoes.